So my name is John Powell. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley and director of the Othering and Belonging Institute. And it's a delight to be here with you and share with you some thoughts around belonging and public health, especially as it affects ACAs. And I'm going to be talking about how belonging is different than inclusion and even equity. Next slide. So the heart of equity, if you will, is, at least as it's practiced, not necessarily as it's articulated, is to look at disparities. And this slide here, which is a little bit busy, and I'll make it available to you, basically just suggests that in terms of medical access, there's a huge disparity between different groups based on race, ethnicity, and so forth. Next slide. So there's something going on in the country. Of course, we all know that because we live in the country. In fact, there's something going on in the world. And what's going on is creating tremendous anxiety. And this anxiety is being fueled by a number of things. One is the demographic change, the climate change, technology, globalization. And of course, on a more recent version of this, I put the pandemic. And at least for many of us, to a couple of weeks ago, the election itself was a source of tremendous anxiety. That anxiety that's being produced by these rapid changes is normal, it's biological. And it also creates stress. What we do with that anxiety is sociological. We can do different things with it. And one of the roles of leadership is to actually help people manage the anxiety, help people give meaning to it. So the anxiety is sort of almost like a feeling. It doesn't tell us how to think about it. It doesn't tell us what to do. And there are two major ways in which we respond to anxiety. And one is called breaking, where the anxiety gets organized around an apparent other. It could be someone's race, someone's religion, someone's sexual orientation. But if you look at the spread of authoritarian nationalism, which is sweeping the world, there's always a designated other at the center of that narrative. And so the other sometimes is, if you're in India, it's the Hindus. If you're in Hungary, it's immigrants. If you're in the United States, we have a whole bunch of others, Blacks, Native Americans, immigrants. And it's basically saying our problems are caused by those people. The world would be better if those people weren't in our midst. That's called breaking. The other story is that, yes, the world is changing and this can be stressful, but it also can be hopeful. We're moving to a new phase. We're coming closer together. We're seeing each other in different ways. We're being connected. We are building a larger we. We are redefining the world, and we're doing it together. And we do that not just by fiat, we do it by deeply listening to each other, by deeply engaging in compassionate practices that where the other is present. And of course, at a deep level, the other is not an other at all. That's called bridging. And I won't talk about bonding, but the point is that a leader plays a critical role whether or not people actually decide to break or bridge. They don't come to that decision by themselves. They come through it through the narratives, the stories, the practices, the possibilities that set off in terms of leaders. And all of you are leaders. All of you have some role in terms of helping people negotiate these anxieties. These anxieties are not going to go away. The world is not going to slow down. It's going to speed up. How do we help people navigate this change? And so that's a big takeaway. Again, the stories you tell, the role of leaders actually is quite important. Next slide. So I've introduced an idea of belonging. I want to introduce the idea of othering. In some ways, it's important to understand the problem we're trying to solve and the solution that we might then adopt. And this is actually a takeoff of those of you who know from W.B. Du Bois, who wrote over 100 years ago that the problem of the 20th century was race, the color line. Uh, and I would say the problem of the 21st century is othering. And othering, as I already suggested, doesn't just happen around race, certainly happens around race in the United States, but can happen around any particular axis. The content of others, of the other, is vacant. It can be filled in by anything. If you think about Rwanda, which was the highest or um, genocide proportionally in the 20th century, the people were the same race, they were the same religion, in many cases they were the same ethnicity, they had lived together for decades, if not hundreds of years. And yet, with some nefarious work of the elites, they were able to separate those people, sometimes by how many cows they have, and to have people commit genocide against people who literally before were part of the family, a part of their church. So there's no natural other. Othering happens largely through a sociological process that, again, leaders play a huge role. And that's happening all over the world right now. We're talking about people as if they're not fully human, as if they don't belong. Next slide. These are just some of the ways in which we are familiar with othering. And othering can happen in a very transitory way. Like if someone doesn't acknowledge you on the street, you go to a restaurant and someone won't serve you. Someone push you on a bus if you're on a bus. But there's also a durable othering which is done at an institutional level, othering that's done by the state, othering that's done by institutions and structures. So, for example, if I'm in a wheelchair and there's no access to the building has othered me. The building says I don't belong there. It's not my building. And even if someone can actually physically lift me up and take me in the building, it puts me in a very different role. And so othering happens in that case in a durable way because the building is there day in and day out. And again, so we have to sort of pay attention to all the different ways in which we other, as well as understanding what are some dominant ways we other. Othering is very powerful and very strong. In many ways, people believe that how we other is also how we constitute the we. We constitute the we by talking about those that are not we. Next slide. So what's the effect of being othered? When we're othered, we don't have an effective voice. That is, as much as we talk, as much as we protest, our voice is not registered. We lack representation in the places of power and decision making, whether it's in Congress, whether it's in corporate boards, or whether it's in institutions. We lack recognition. Even though people see us, they don't recognize us. And we lack power. We lack the ability to influence outcomes in behalf of ourselves and others. All of these are indications of othering. And when we are othered, bad things happen, both politically, psychologically, and medically. Next slide. So I've been talking about belonging and othering, and I'm going to talk more about it in a few minutes. But first of all, I want to put a pin in this. Most of you probably come to this work through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. So why am I talking about bridging and belonging and othering instead of DEI? So we all live within structures and structures live within us. We all live within stories and stories live within us. But we have shifted from focusing on inclusion to focusing on belonging. So what's the difference? And I'll come back to this a few times. But one way of thinking about it is that inclusion is where you're asked to join something that belongs to someone else. The example I often give is that I'm giving a party. I can't see many of you, but I know you're pretty cool, so I'm giving a party. You're all invited. Here's the rub. It's my party, my music, my food, my time. You're invited, but you're a guest. So come and enjoy yourself and then leave when I tell you to. That's inclusion. And so we bring people into institutions, whether it's medical institutions, whether it's meetings, we bring them to institutions on our terms. And then all the work in terms of fitting in is placed on them. That's inclusion. That's better than being left out completely, but it's not belonging. Belonging is predicated on the notion that you co-create, that you don't just join something, you actually make something. You collectively make something. You have a voice, you have representation, you have power. Um, and so belonging is where you're co-creating the thing you're joining for everyone, not just for your group, but for all groups and the institution itself. Uh, so that's the difference between belonging and inclusion. And we do that in part through bridging. Again, bridging requires that we're willing to engage someone, not simply change them, engage them in terms of who they are. We're willing to listen. We're willing to be present. Next slide. Now, there's a lot of work on this. We can measure this. We can measure human connection. It's interesting, in the midst of COVID, and we're now facing a huge surge, one of the deep things, one of the difficult things that frankly I think the medical profession and scientists have not helped us with, that is connection. They tell us, yes, you need to be afraid of each other. Yes, wear a mask. I do wear my mask. Yes, stay 6 feet away, or maybe 12. And I try to do that as well. But they ignore the fact that in order for us to thrive, in order for us to be healthy, we need connections. We are deeply social beings. And they haven't told us how to do that. So instead of just saying, keep 6 feet apart, they should also say, and this is how you connect in the time of COVID. This is how you connect in the midst of a pandemic. I'm sure you've seen the recent data. Suicide rate, which is traditionally highest among indigenous people, Native Americans, is exploding among young people. By some accounts, young people are committing suicide at a rate never before seen in the United States. And many people attribute it to the lack of connection, the lack of contact. So we need to figure out how to live into this contact in the midst of a pandemic. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing a surge. The people are just saying, I'm not going to stay away from my family at Thanksgiving. I had something happen recently that I'll share with you. My brother-in-law died last week. And I have a very close and loving family. And my brother-in-law, I feel it's actually a misnomer to say he's my brother-in-law. He's really a brother. He's really a friend. They live in Detroit. I live in Berkeley. And I talked to my sister and my daughter. My daughter's here in the Bay Area with me. And my daughter said, what are you going to do? Are you going to go back to Detroit? And I said, I'm thinking about it. And her response was, that's stupid. You have to have your kids remind you periodically that you're stupid. And I said, I know that that's not wise. I'm not trying to get on a plane to go back to Detroit, but also I'm not going to abandon my family in time of stress or in time of need. Turns out that my sister is going to have a service in the spring, and so she said, there's no need to come right now. But my point is that we need each other. We need to show up for each other. We need to connect with each other, and it's not easy to do in this environment. And you as medical workers, as leaders, can help us with that. Next slide. So the heart of belonging, which we've already touched on, is co-creating and being seen. There's a South African word, which is sabawanu, which is translated many different ways, but one translation is, I see you, or we see you. And that doesn't mean just physically, it means I really see you. And by seeing you, I see all of your ancestors before you. And the response is, I am present. And we need to be seen, we need to be acknowledged, and we need the capacity to co-create. Next slide. And part of having a we is having a story. That's interesting. As we think about stories, who is in the story? Who's not? And if you're in the story, how are you represented? You show up as a positive figure, or you show up as a villain? And we know that marginalized communities are not just marginal in terms of access to healthcare, access to opportunity, access to recognition. They're left out of stories. Or if they show up in stories, they show up in some flat or unattractive way. Uh, this that I saw about what the kid asked his parents after they read him a story about the jungle. The kid says, I hear everywhere that the lion is the king of the jungle. But every story we read, the lion gets killed and the hunter wins. Why is that? And the parents' response is, that will keep being the case until the lion writes their own story. So one of the things I think is important, and actually I've been thinking about this as we are talking about our country being so divided. We need more stories, and we need to actually be aware of each other's stories. We need to story together, if you will. And again, that's one of the things that leaders can do. Right now, there's stories about was the election fair or not. It's not just a fact, it's a story, it's a narrative, and it matters. You saw in terms of the mask. There was a period of time where there was no division in the country around wearing a mask. Our leaders stepped up, and some said, don't wear a mask, I'm not wearing a mask, this is BS. Others said, I'm wearing a mask, and it split the country right down the middle. So the role of leaders matter. Next slide. So belonging. These are at least 4 things you need to actually practice belonging. And it's not like you ever get there. It's not like you're ever done. It's not like, okay, I created this space where I belong and now I can kick back and just enjoy. But you need agency. You have a sense of who you are individually and collectively. Excuse me. You need power. You need the ability to influence. You need care and love. You have to care about people, yourselves, your community, your expanding community, and you need to take responsibility. And I'll just pause for a minute and think about responsibility. We emphasize responsibility more than we emphasize blame. Sometimes, and it's not saying there's not blame, but that always gets litigated. It's your fault, no, it's his fault, no, it's my fault. Maybe, maybe not. And again, it's not saying people haven't done things and countries haven't done things. But it's easier to focus on responsibility. What do we do going forward? What's our role going forward? In belonging, we say we are all responsible. We're co-creating, and therefore it's not my party. And so you can come to and talk about the last party I gave and that you weren't invited. And if you did come, that it was a terrible party with terrible music. And okay, I'll try to do better. But this one, this time, it's not going to be my party. It's going to be our party. We're all responsible. We pick the music. We pick the food. Now, it's in terms of power, responsibility is never equal. It's never completely symmetrical. There's people who have invariably more power, more authority, more voice than others. But everyone should have a voice. Everyone should have some power. And so everyone share in responsibility. And you as leaders have more responsibility, in part because you have more power. Next slide. And part of the thing in terms of actually being an effective leader is not just to come up with good rules or good ideas, it's actually to build trust. How do you actually build trust? So I was on a call yesterday with the folks in Minnesota around policing. And obviously that's one area where there's a tremendous lack of trust. And I would say the lack of trust has been earned. And they were talking about what should they do? What should they do moving forward? And they had a lot of really wonderful ideas. And one idea they had is like, let's pull together people from various different communities, including the police, and come up with a set of solutions that everyone can buy into. Sounds like a good idea. And I said, except given your past, it won't work. There's not the trust. People aren't going to come sit down and talk to you. They're not going to open up to you. You have to demonstrate that this is different. You have to say, we're not going to have a commission for 2 years studying the problem, and then we'll come up with something. People have seen that. They've done that. They've been there. So we need to sort of think about the condition we're in. How do we build trust? And how do we build on the trust that we built? Next slide. And part of the thing in terms of dealing with trust is that we're dealing with the issue of trauma. And trauma is a huge problem, especially for marginalized communities, but increasingly for the whole country. We're a traumatized country. And as we know, trauma doesn't go away. So an incident happened. And we know, for example, in terms of policing, that when a Black person is killed in that local community, the whole community is traumatized. When a Native American young person commits suicide, it's not just that person's family, the whole tribe is traumatized. And COVID, of course, is sweeping trauma across the country. And so, how do we actually move toward belonging from trauma? And one of the things that we miss in the United States because we're so individualistic, we talk about resiliency. Resiliency is a team sport. One person by him or herself invariably would not be very resilient. Resilient means, in a sense, you have a network, you have relationships that help sustain you, that help carry you through hard times. Next slide. So these are just some examples of othering. We looked at the smallpox epidemic in San Francisco in 1876, or the tuberculosis epidemic in 1938. So in the first epidemic, there was, they blamed it on the Chinese. And there was a whole story. So all of these things, when something happened, it comes with a narrative, or you have to create a narrative around it. It's not just there. How do we understand it? How do we make meaning of it? And we don't know how to respond until we make meaning. And so in this case, in 1876, the story was, it was the unscrupulous Chinese that were lying and stealing, and maybe we should send them all back to China. There was nothing about the conditions that the Chinese were living in, cramped quarters, that they were living oftentimes where there was not adequate water, not because they chose to, because that's how we housed them. So we looked at people and not structure. And this is actually a normal, and oftentimes a response. So we saw, for example, when COVID data first came out that Blacks and Native people were actually disproportionately being affected, the first impulse in our country was to turn and blame those people. What's wrong with Black people? In fact, the Surgeon General talked about if Black people would lose weight, stop smoking, exercise more, they wouldn't be dying so much. Again, it didn't talk about the fact that they didn't have access to healthcare facilities, were living in cramped quarters, were living already in a situation where people called them, at this point, essential workers. We're telling people to go home, but telling Black and Latino families to go to work. Or our Native populations telling people to wash your hands. Why don't you wash your hands? Oh, that's right, you don't have access to water. So the stories we tell matter. So by 1938, the blame shifted. We started looking at the conditions. It still wasn't perfect, but it was better. And it wasn't perfect in part because we still limited the Chinese themselves telling the story. We were talking about them instead of their participating in the story about all of us. And one of the things that changed is that from 1876 to 1938, the Chinese developed political voice. They developed power. So again, if you go back to that circle, the ability to have agency and power is critical in terms of belonging. It's not just a feeling. You have to have the conditions present to fully belong. Next slide. Because we're so individualistic in our society, when we hear about othering, and I know it's a wonky word, but when we hear about othering, we think the solution is saming. To say, okay, I'm Christian, but Muslims are just like me, except, they go to a mosque instead of a church. Or, okay, that person's Black and I'm white, but we're really just alike. That seems like a positive move, but it's erasing the person. It's saying the person is me. I'm not you. You're not me. And in some ways, it demands that the person be me. So you can come work at my place, but you have to behave just like I do. You have to look just like I look. You have to dress just like I dress. No braids, no head covering, no face covering. I set the standard. And everyone who meets the standard of me, at least the story goes, is okay. And we saw that in, for example, when Clinton adopted Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Okay, you're gay. I don't want to hear about it. Don't talk about it. Other people can talk about their relationships, their loved ones, but you can't because that's not the standard. So that was a question of saming. So the way to address othering is not to insist that everyone become just like me, but it's belonging. The belonging is predicated on the notion that everyone brings their full self to the table. They're not preconditions of at that level in terms of belonging, and then everyone participate in co-creating. Next slide. So belonging means being fully human, participating, being seen, and co-creating. It's about the ability to make demands on society, and it's about the ability to actually give back to society. Next slide. So there are many different aspects of belonging. And as we look at diversity, equity, inclusion, all of them actually have an aspect of belonging, but they don't quite get it. And so this is taking all of these concepts, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and taking it to a different level. And so in that sense, belonging is just a deeper dive of all of these concepts. Next slide. There's a great deal of research now and examples of why belonging is important. Most of you are in the area of health, and there's overwhelming evidence now that people can't have good health unless they have a sense of belonging. There's a book written by an author called Happiness for All, and she looks at different populations and how well they're performing. And her data shows that to some extent, if you're extremely poor, it's hard to have good health individually or collectively. And as you go up the economic ladder, you generally do better. But there are two counterexamples that I want to give you. So if you think about low birth weight babies, that tracks very closely with socioeconomic status. But there's a wrinkle in here. Black women, even when they're middle class and professionals, are still likely to have low birth weight babies. In fact, a Black woman with a college degree and a middle income salary is more likely to have a low birth weight baby than a white woman who drops out of school and who's poor. That's counterintuitive. That's not what the research otherwise suggests. Here's another example. In the book Happiness for All, the author talks about, again, looking at different populations and how healthy they are, how well they're adjusted to society, how much they deal with, how resilient they are in dealing with trauma. But then she found something that was puzzling to her, and that was there was one group that was very poor and didn't have much opportunity, but it had very high outcomes in terms of well-being. And this was older, very religious Black women. Thank God for them, they just saved us. But anyway, when I asked her about this, how do you make sense of that? And she looked at countries all over the world. And she said she wasn't 100% sure, but what the data suggested is that these women had each other. They were a community. There was a space where they really belonged. And it wasn't episodical. They went to church not once a week, not twice a week. They went to church 4 and 5 times a week. And so to them, they also had meaning. They had something beyond them that gave meaning. This wasn't true for younger Black people. It wasn't true for white people. White people tended, if they went to church, they went once a week and then they were done. So belonging, creating a space where people really feel that they're seen, where they're recognized, where they're loved, has powerful outcomes in terms of health and well-being that sometimes overwhelm some of the negative things like being economically poor. Next slide. So there are examples of healthcare and private sector stepping into a space of belonging. So Kaiser, which all of you are sure aware of. I know it's big in the Northwest. Uh, the former CEO of Kaiser has tried to make Kaiser a belonging place. And he talks about this in a number of his writings, and even having to let some of his senior staff go who were not willing to create a culture of belonging. Uh, he talked about not having us and them, even in terms of unions, and Kaiser's unionized. Um, and so they have a deliberate effort to create a belonging culture. Now, my goddaughter is a doctor at Kaiser, and she would probably take some exceptions to this. But the point is that Kaiser is trying, deliberately trying, to create a space where belonging is real. And they have dialogue circles, they have mentoring projects. They're not there. They still have a long way to go, but they have made progress. And part of that shows up in terms of outcomes, in terms of fewer strikes, fewer work stoppages, um, and hopefully better care for not just the people who work there, but for the people who actually use Kaiser as their healthcare. Next slide. Devoted Health. This is a healthcare Insurance Company Plus, and I actually have done some work with them. And their approach is that their clients is their family, and they approach caring for their clients as if it's your uncle or aunt with love. And so they are very deliberate about bringing love into healthcare, about bringing belonging into healthcare. In fact, they say we want to put the care back in healthcare. Uh, they have investors, they're a private company, and they tell investors, this is not where you're going to make the highest yield on your money. This is not what we're about. If you're a conscious investor who cares about people, this could be a great place for you. But if all you care about is money, this is not your place. And again, uh, when the pandemic happened, they were very innovative in trying to figure out how to reach out and make sure people were taken care of. So they take the issue of belonging very seriously. They're still relatively new and they're expanding, but at the center of their effort is belonging and love. Next slide. Um, this is a book by someone that I'm doing a webcast with in the next month or so. And he talks about the economics of belonging. And basically saying that, again, people need to feel like they belong. One reason he argues that the country is so divided is that people, including white people, including white men, feel estranged. It's not just not having enough stuff, it's not having a sense of belonging. It's not feeling like being disrespected, not having a voice. And so when that happens, you get the kind of society and country that we have right now. Next slide. The point I want to make with this is, again, it's just structures are not neutral. So when we think about belonging, think about structures and culture. How do you create structures that belong? Now, what we do oftentimes is we create a structure and then we realize we left somebody out. And so we go back and try to make corrections. And that's better than not making corrections. But ideally, from the ground up, we would design the structure to actually produce the outcome we want. And so I say it's not a thing of actually looking at structural impediments. That's good. But go beyond that to affirmatively design structures for belonging, to affirmatively design structures for belonging. So if you build a building and you forget to build a ramp, an access ramp for someone in a wheelchair, you add on to it. And that's what it'll look like. It'll look like you added it on. It'll look clumsy. If you build a building that's designed for everybody, it will have access ramps, but they won't be clumsy. They'll be built into the structure. Next slide. So again, we know structures can enhance or limit opportunity. Next slide. I should say on the last slide, we've done, and this available, we can do what we call opportunity mapping. We can map out the distribution of opportunity and access to different populations. And that's one of the things that if you haven't done, I would suggest you take a look at it. And now it's being done, I think, literally started it, but now it's being done by essentially mappers all over the country, but it's a good way of sort of adding concrete spatial dimensions to opportunity. And what we see when we do this initially, we find that communities that are marginal have less access to physical opportunity. They're more likely to live next to toxic dump sites than to a park. Next slide. So there are different types of change and there are different types of leaders. There's transformational change and transactional change. And it's important for you, sometimes you need both and they can be built on top of each other. Sometimes you need one or the other, and sometimes they're oppositional. I think it's clear to most people in the country that we really need transformational change. We may need to do some transactional things as well, but the country needs something deeper. One way of thinking about transactional change, the example I use is, let's say there's a train and it goes from point A to point B. And on the train, all the passengers are older, well-heeled white men. That's who it serves. So we might say that's not really right, given the diversity in our country, given our demographics. Everyone should have access to the train, including white men, but not exclusively white men. So now we bring women, we bring people of color, we bring people who are LGBTQ, we bring, you name it, right? So now we have a diverse number of passengers on the train. That's transactional. Why is that transactional? Because if that's all we do, the train still goes from point A to point B. We haven't changed the tracks. We haven't changed the structure. So now I get to go the same place that the older white man went. Well, I might want to go someplace different. And so we need to think about, is the destination the right place? That requires transformation, even to ask that question. Do I get to ask the question, this is the right destination? And that's really important in terms of health. Is the way the health field is already set up the right destination? And if it's not enough just to bring people into it. It's important to think about what is the right destination and have everyone participate, co-create in that. That's transformation. Next slide. So transactional is change within the existing structure. You're not changing the structure, you're changing, you're populating who has access to the structure. And we see, again, I'm not against that, and that's not bad. It just doesn't take us where we need to go in many instances. Another example would be, think about what's happening with policing in this country. A lot of people are dismayed and disappointed that even when they bring more Blacks and Latinos onto the police force, it doesn't always seem to produce the kind of change we want. And so some people are calling for something more radical, even abolishing police. And I'm agnostic about that, but what I am strongly in favor of is thinking about, how do we organize the police to produce the outcomes we want, policing in a way that the structure is doing what we want it to do. Structures are not neutral. Next slide. And structures show up in our body. Sure you know the term allostatic load and telomeres. We now have the concept of that people would say outside and inside. Now we recognize that the body is reflecting the outside phenomena. The body is reflecting the outside stresses. And they show up and they have an impact on how we live and how long we live. And we can measure this. We can measure allostatic load. We can measure telomeres. And I'm hoping at some point we'll have baselines at a community level, and we'll know when a community is being exposed to prolonged stress, and we'll make the appropriate responses to collective stress, not just individual stress. And I think, you know, the telomeres, a couple of researchers, one is a friend of mine who did this work on telomeres. I think they got Nobel Prize for it. Telomeres basically measure the tip of something on the tip of our cells that allow the cells to absorb nutrients. And as we expose to stress, the telomeres shorten and become frayed, and our ability to absorb nutrients into the cells become compromised. And again, this is racialized. So blacks have the telomeres, because of stress, is actually more frayed at birth and fray faster than whites, given the stress. We can reverse this, but we don't reverse it just by giving someone a pill or a shot. We reverse it by changing their conditions, by changing the stress and what we call the social determinants of health in terms of producing different outcomes. Next slide. So I keep saying, we should share in terms of what our goal is, where we want to go. We do this through something called targeted universalism. And targeted universalism says we want to get everyone to the universal. Of course, we have to spend time thinking about what are the universals that we're trying to achieve. And then, once we have those universals, we then look at how people are situated within structures, within culture, within power, and we'd have targeted strategies to get them to that universal goal. So in our society, sometimes we get confused. We think we should treat everybody the same, but that doesn't make any sense. Everybody's not situated the same. Our structures situate us differently. And so Target University says, yes, we may have universal goals, but our strategies are necessarily targeted. Now, this is slightly different than the way we approach equity. Equity oftentimes focuses just on disparities. So there's been an effort for years to try to reduce the disparities between the suicide rate of Black men and white men. And for those who actually embrace that strategy, there's some good news. That disparity is actually declining, and by some accounts is gone. But not because Black men are killing themselves at a lower rate, but because white men are killing themselves at a higher rate. And when people see that, it's like, well, that's not exactly what I was hoping for. What were you hoping for? I was hoping that people would stop killing themselves, period. Well, that's the universal stated. Don't use the favorite group simply as a benchmark for what you're trying to achieve. State it, discuss it, debate it, and come to some agreement. And then the way to reduce suicide rate in the Black community among men, as opposed to the white community among men, as opposed to the Native community, is actually going to be quite different. And we're just now really starting to embrace that. And there's more I could say, but I won't because of time. Next slide. This is just a portrayal of what I just described. Again, you don't treat everybody the same. And structures are treating people a certain way. So it means that we have to make structures that are people-centered, and all people, not one person, not one group, but all the people that reflect our society. Next slide. And of course, in terms of understanding this, it means we have to look at data. Now, I know from working with Liz and others that once we talk about data, you also back into the problem of trust. It's like, well, who collects the data? Who's going to use the data? Because we've too often been the subject that we haven't had agency. We've been, I should say, the object of someone's work, but we didn't have agency. And that's a problem that have to be fixed, but we have to look at data, have to figure out a way in terms of understanding how we're situated. Next slide. So, and we also have to think about what is the story and who's telling it. Next slide. And this is actually, you could say, a sort of like a opportunity mapping, but it's actually looking at disparities, and then based on disparities, the colors sort of reflect high and low poverty, and then the circles represent populations. So you see where people are living in relationship to different opportunities. Next slide. And this may be a little busy for you, but the gist of it is that people of color tend to live in low opportunity areas. Next slide. And yes, indeed, there tend to be huge disparities in outcomes between those populations. Next slide. So again, the goal is not just eliminating the disparities, because again, while disparities are indeed a problem, eliminating disparities make it just a different problem. It also can create tensions. If you feel like, in terms of the way we do equity, we actually sometimes pit groups against each other, fighting over what's perceived as scarce resources. It's a zero-sum game, whereas belonging and target universalism basically says we want to get everyone to that universal, not just the most marginal, everyone. We may focus more on the most marginal, but we're not going to ignore other groups in the process. Next slide. Here again are some examples of things happening around your region. In Oregon, you actually have disaggregated data, which is useful. And you can look at what some of those disparities are, but then you actually need to state what is the universal, not just closing the disparities. Next slide. In California, under our COVID equity mandate, again, each county has to collect data, and then it has to identify marginalized populations in a disaggregated way. And it's not allowed to move to a less restrictive status until the marginalized populations are doing better. So if you look at aggregated data, you might say, overall, San Francisco is doing fine. But then if you look at Blacks and Latinos in San Francisco, they're not doing fine. And so what California has actually said is that you have to move everybody toward doing better, not just the aggregate. Next slide. So again, this is a portrayal of what I talked about at the beginning, that we're moving to belonging, which means we're not just joining something, we're actually co-creating the thing that we're joining. It didn't exist before we arrived. Next slide. And this problem of isolation and loneliness is endemic across the world. This is actually, in Europe, they've created a new minister for loneliness. We might want to do something analogous to that here in the United States, but we haven't done it as far as I know. Next slide. And they found that when they actually bring people together, it has concrete outcomes in terms of creating jobs, projects, and people participating and reducing loneliness and having better health outcomes. Next slide. This is another place in Europe where they have a friendship bench. Basically, anyone can go sit at this bench, and you sit on the bench means that you're willing to talk to someone else sitting on the bench. I've talked to some restaurants before COVID about doing something like that here. Have a table where you say, this is a table, a communal table. You can come in and just talk to people. You can come in and connect. Next slide. This is basically how you operationalize target universalism belonging. You have to take into account each group. You have to be inclusive regardless to differences. You have to communicate the strategy. You have to avoid breaking. So when you have people compete over scarce resources, that's not bridging, that's actually breaking. You have people participate in the data, in the power, and the stories. and you move us toward belonging. Next slide. This is really a recapitulation of what I just shared, so I'll just go to the next slide. Again, some examples. San Francisco Health Improvement Partnership. So San Francisco is actually trying to look at how do you create belonging through multiple lenses, not a single thing. And even in the time of COVID, they're continuing to move forward on this. Next slide. So how can you create a belonging culture in your ACH around the Northwest? And I think you started, I know you started because I started with some of you. It's an ongoing process. It's not one thing. It's a journey, not a destination. But think about this deliberately. Next slide. What do you need to transform? What's working, what's not working? How do you actually tell stories that actually include people? How do you actually think about race in a way that doesn't divide? Next slide. And that's it. But I'm open to take questions. I think there's a few minutes. Let's see what time we have here. I think we have a few minutes.
Thank you so much, John, for that really wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. Hi, everybody. I'm Bonnie Wennerstrom from the Healthcare Authority, and I'll be posing a couple of questions. We have time for just a few, and there are a couple of questions that we received in the last presentation that we will pose to you now. So first question, what if the practices of a particular population puts others at risk? For example, a group opposes masking during a pandemic.
That's a great question. So like a lot of these things have a lot of nuance that we didn't get a chance to go into an hour, because we're talking about something really transformational at almost immediate scale, but also at a global scale. So there's a lot of things to work through. But let me give you one story that I think will speak to the question asked. We just came off an election. There's something called canvassing, which is basically go out and talk to people, try to convince them to vote for your candidate or your issue. And it's been around for 50, 60 years. Then more recently, there was a shift to what's called relational canvassing. And then there was another shift, most recently again, called deep canvassing. And so I'm talking about deep canvassing. Deep canvassing actually builds in part on some of our work around bridging. And bridging is actually engaging a person, not to change their mind, but to see the person who they are, to see the full person. And so when you engage in deep canvassing, it takes a long time. To do the traditional canvassing is 3 to 5 minutes. You know, you have your check chart, you have a script, you go through it very quickly. Deep canvassing, you start off with sort of, so how are you, Bonnie? How's your day? How's your family? How are you managing in terms of COVID? Do you need anything? What are you anxious about? What worries you about the future? Tell me about yourself. So it's person-centered, and you're asking the person to share their story. You can't do that in 3 to 5 minutes. That can take half an hour or 45 minutes. So when deep canvassing first started, a lot of organizers were skeptical. It's like, I don't have time, right? Here's the I guess the interesting thing. It turns out that not only does deep canvassing work better than canvassing, it's by a study done at Yale, 102 times more effective. Now, when I talk to deep canvassers, I say, and it transformed the person being on the other end of being asked the questions, but also transform the person asking the question. And that transformation tends to stick. And the person is more likely to actually support what you want to support, 102 times more likely. But here's the contradiction, and it's subtle, that at its deepest level, Bridging is not trying to change someone's mind. So if you don't want to wear a mask and I'm really bridging with you at its deepest level, I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm trying to understand you. I'm trying to see you. But it turns out when people are seen and when they're understood, they're more likely to change their mind. So if I start off by shaming you, you're an AB for not wearing a mask and I'm not going to be with you, good luck with that. But if a person sees that, you know what, okay, you don't want to wear a mask, I understand why, but let me tell you why I wear a mask and why I'm concerned. Now the person is more likely to change their mind because they care about you, not because you're right, but because, okay, this is important to you and I'm seeing that, then I'm willing to support it. But there are limits. There are certain people who, for strategic reasons, other reasons, they're not going to go along. And so, how far can we go in terms of this? We don't really know. But if we start creating conditions, if we begin to see each other, it's clear we could be in a much better place than we are right now. And also, power matters. Also, we're situated differently, so people are having different life experiences, and if we share those, we're more likely to build bridges. But also, leaders matter. So if the leaders say, don't talk to those people, they're cockroaches, which is what happened in Rwanda, then a person internalizes that. They don't see the person anymore. They're not interested in bridging. But cockroach you want to kill, and that's what happened in Rwanda. So we may have situations where we can't bridge, and I oftentimes say we start off with short bridges. We start off with things that are easier. We don't start off with the most difficult. First of all, we're not skilled yet. We're not, it's like a muscle. You don't start off running a marathon. You start off running a short distance, you get in shape, and then eventually it's like, okay, now I can run 26 miles. So start off with something that's manageable. And short bridge might be bringing together. One reason short bridges tend to work, is that the affect, the caring is already there. So I was doing some work yesterday in Minneapolis, like I said, on policing, with a focus on the Black community, where there's a split between older Blacks and younger Blacks, but they care about each other already. So that's a shorter bridge. If we start off with the people who don't care about each other, who hate each other, that's going to be harder. And in those situations, you may not start with the issues. There's a lot more I could say, but that's just to give you a flavor of how you approach this.
Thank you so much, John. And I have to say, even though I knew you were using it as an example, when you asked me those questions about how I was doing and how my family is and what I was worried about, that made me feel good, even in this moment now. So,
well, that was the whole goal. I didn't want to ask the question. I want you to feel good.
So, thank you. I think, do we have time for one more? Would that be all
Sure,
right?
we can do one more.
Okay. So another question is, how can we get connected to resources around opportunity mapping?
Opportunity mapping now has become mainstream. Before the Obama administration brought it into HUD, it's actually, I can, drop me a note offline and I can hook you up with, but it's actually become the dominant kind of mapping. Raj Chetty, who's probably the most renowned mapper now in the United States, has built on that work, and he does a kind of opportunity mapping. The University of Wisconsin, they've actually expanded it. So the work continues. It's now mainstream, or much more mainstream. And as people sort of map and understand the dynamic and movement of opportunity in relationship to populations. Manuel Pastor has done done great work around opportunity mapping. I started this when I was at the University of Minnesota almost 30 years ago. It's now, then I moved to the Ohio State, and so the Kerwin Institute had a critical role. And as just a footnote, when I left Ohio State, I said I would not compete with them, so I didn't bring it to University of California, Berkeley. But it's been long enough now that we're starting to do more second and third generation of opportunity mapping. And my guess is it won't be long before you see it on Google, that Google will be doing it.
Wow, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I think that's all we have time for questions. So thank you everybody for those. I just want to say, John Powell, thank you so much for your presentation today, for being with us, for helping us learn, and for giving us some tools to do better. So thank you so much for your time and all of your work. And also want to thank everybody for being here today. And we really appreciate all the work that's going on and appreciate you so much.
Well, Bonnie, I want to thank you as well as thank all the people who participate in this, but also special thanks to Liz. You know, one of my frustrations, I've been in and out of the academy, and one of the reasons I go in and out is because as much as I love ideas, ideas are just ideas unless they're put into practice. And I don't think of myself as an academic, I think of myself as a pracademic. And you guys are putting it into practice. And so really the soul of the work lives with you, and we continue to learn. So thanks for letting us be part of this journey.